Good afternoon. I'm Caprice Moore, Interim Vice Provost for Global Learning, and I am happy to welcome you to S&T's Global Learning Inaugural Fall Speaker Series. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Beth Kania-Gosche, Chair and Professor of the Teacher Education and Certification Department here at S&T. Dr. Kania-Gosche will speak to us on the topic, Juggling Life During the Pandemic. Certainly, we all have made some adjustments during these unprecedented times. So let's listen in, learn some tidbits from our expert educator, and at the end, there'll be time for Q&A, and we'll move forward from there. Dr. Kania-Gosche, you have the platform.
Thank you. I'm so privileged to be asked to speak for the first Global Speaker Series. And I will say, when I heard the topic, I thought I could talk about this for hours. So I'm the Department Chair of Teacher Education and Certification, but I'm also a mom. I have two girls at home, age 8 and 12. And so I just want to ask how many of you out there had children at home with you during the lockdown the past 5 months? So there's a little reaction button down at the bottom. You can click and give me a thumbs up or whatever. And if you feel comfortable, if you want to drop in the chat, I'll be asking throughout this to make it a little more interactive for you to answer some questions. If you could drop in the chat the ages of the kids who were at home with you during lockdown, or you might still have them at home with you depending on where you are and what your circumstances are. So my kids are 8 and 12, he'll turn 12 in July. So my kids were fairly self-sufficient in that they could get themselves food, they could go to the bathroom, they did not require constant supervision. I'm seeing some of you got some younger ones at home there that needed more supervision than mine. And lots of kitties I see, lots of pets at home there with us during the pandemic. So I just want to, for all of you who have kids, I'm going to take a moment to make you feel better. Like, I have a PhD in education. My job is to run a department that trains teachers. And I will say, being at home with my own kids, trying to help them learn at home while I was trying to do my job was really challenging. and I train teachers for a living. So I have a new appreciation. So as a department chair, and probably like all of you, I'm constantly juggling, right? But during the pandemic, that juggle changed. It was sort of a slow juggle, and it is for me right now. So I drop my kids off at school. So in the morning, I'm mom, and then I have all the time when they're at school, when I'm a department chair and I'm teaching, I'm doing my work stuff. And then when my kids come home, I switch back. So I switch back to mom. But the past 5 months when I had my kids at home with me, I was mom and department chair and professor, like almost simultaneously. It was happening just, you know, who knows? I would be on a Zoom meeting and then, mom, I don't know if that happened to any of you, it happened to me all the time. And that is just totally different from what it's like at work, where I might get interrupted, but it's by another adult. It's not because something broke or I need to go upstairs and break up a fight between my two daughters. Not a physical fight, but a verbal one for sure. Those things don't happen at work. So I really had to make a mental adjustment. Basically, it changed everything about how we functioned at home, how I functioned at work, completely changed everything. And it not just for me. If we look at what surveys and data are demonstrating, for example, the American Psychological Association, they give a survey every year about stress, how they rate their stress on a scale of 1 to 10. And you don't have to tell me your response, but kind of think about how you would respond to that. Where is your stress? You know, 1 being really low, 10 being almost not able to deal with life because you're so stressed, okay? 1 to 10. So typically the average is around 4.9, okay? Just nationally, that's what the average is. That's what it's been since 2007 when they started administering this survey. In 2020, that was the first time they saw a statistical jump, as you can probably imagine. And what they found was that non-parents, their stress level was a reported 5.5. And for parents, it was a 6.7, which is a huge jump from 4.9. And I can imagine, they didn't report this, but I would imagine the younger your children, probably the higher your stress level. And the more children you have, the higher your stress level. So it's not just, I'm just trying to validate probably the feelings you individually had. As a nation and probably across the globe, we're really in a mental health crisis, just to be perfectly honest. We're in a health crisis with the pandemic, of course, but also it's affecting our mental health, our mental well-being, our emotional well-being. And so that's some of what I'm going to talk about today, is how do we deal with that as at work, at home, as a leader. Perhaps you're a manager. I'm a department chair, which is much like being a manager in higher education. How do we deal with that? So that's what I'm gonna talk about today, because it really is, even if you don't have children at home, I hope this gives you a little bit of perspective if you have employees who do work for you, who have children at home. And I think we all just have more anxiety now than we did before, in part because we're worried about everything. I mean, hurricanes, fires, the pandemic, there's so many things happening that we can be worried about. The CDC reported that anxiety is 3 times higher in the second quarter of 2020 than it was in 2019. And I think we're all feeling that, three times more anxiety. That seems about, that's a quantifiable number for what we're just all feeling internally. And we really need to figure out, how do we deal with that? We cannot keep doing what we've been doing. And you probably heard that a lot. It really has changed everything about our lives. So what I would say with juggling, how do we juggle all these things? We need to pay attention to our emotions and the emotions of the other people around us. Our kids, the other people who live in our household, but also at work, the people we work with. And depending on your context, that may be more difficult. If you're primarily conducting meetings, if your interaction with other people is on Zoom like this, it would be really tough if I was teaching a class and all of you were my students. I have no idea what most of you are feeling or thinking right now. You know, I have to use the chat feature, and it's much harder to read the room, right? To feel people's emotions. So that adds another layer of complexity. But if we think about with our own kids at home, we see them all the time, and we may not think about how our emotional state bleeds over to them. Everybody right now is probably having trouble regulating their emotions, or I don't know if trouble is the way to say it, but we aren't regulating our emotions the same way that we were able to this time last year. So one way to do that is just to pause more and pay attention to what those emotions are. So in that vein, I'm going to take just a minute and ask everybody to think about 2 emotions that would sum up the past 5 or 6 months. Okay? And if you feel comfortable, put those 2 emotions in the chat. What 2 words would you use? And this is not my idea. I got this from Brene Brown. So if you have read any of her books or listened to her podcast, she uses this at the beginning of every meeting that she has with her team. Yes, I'm seeing lots of really heavy words there. Anxiety, frustration, fear, uncertainty. My 2 words would be exhaustion but also relaxation. And these sound like they might contradict, but that's why I asked for 2 words instead of just 1, because it's worth noting that our emotions, they aren't always rational. And the emotions that I'm having might not make sense to you. So it's really not about judging the emotions or evaluating the emotions or saying, well, I don't understand why you would feel that way. Like, you feel that way, period. We're going to value that. And we're going to think about emotions as data. So here, anyone who knows me is probably thinking, well, why? This is very odd that Beth is talking so much about emotions. She's a data person. My specialty is assessment. Like, she's always talking about numbers and how we can quantify things. But I work in teacher education. And one of the things that schools, particularly right now, are trying to do is focusing on that social emotional learning and that type of curriculum. Because good teachers recognize that emotions are, you can't get to the learning if you haven't regulated the emotions of the students in your classroom. And one way you do that is by finding the word that describes your emotion. And that's exactly what I just asked you to do when you put those words in the chat. And I want you to really think about why you chose the words you did instead of others. So why anxiety as opposed to stress? You know, what is the difference between those 2 words? That's not easy to answer, and it's something that's probably different for other people. My word was exhaustion, right? Exhaustion is different than being tired, which is different than being sleepy, all of which are different than if I said weary. So I'm an English teacher. And so I've always focused on vocabulary, but actually there's some great research about emotional vocabulary, being able to recognize the nuances in all those words and figuring out exactly which one identifies what feeling you're having so that you can analyze it like a scientist. Why was I so exhausted? And we can all probably think of a lot of reasons why we've been exhausted the past 5 months. And some of it was due to, as I mentioned at the beginning, that constant worry about my kids and about what was going on in the world. That's very taxing. And as an educational researcher, I know that state of mind is not good, and it's certainly not good for 6 months at a time. So I had to really think about as a mom, how was I going to deal with that? Like, I know what I'm an educational researcher, so I know what the research says. Like, how am I going to enact that in my own house with this unexpected circumstance? Because if you asked me last year, I would have said, oh, yeah, I could never homeschool my kids. I love my kids, but I would never want to try to work from home with them for 5 months. That won't work. You know what? It did work. I figured it out. And all of you did too. And we need to keep reminding ourselves of that, of our own resilience and how we took that circumstance. And you can probably think of some great moments that you had during this lockdown that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Even though that doesn't change how we wouldn't choose that, and we certainly don't want the pandemic to go on any longer than necessary, but it's here, it's happening. So let's take a moment and think about how we're going to deal with it, and acknowledge those emotions. So that was my exhaustion emotion. But my second emotion, because I asked you to give 2, was relaxation. And part of that was because, well, let's be honest, I didn't have to rush my kids out the door every morning to get to school. I didn't have to run to dance class and Girl Scouts and soccer practice. And of course, my kids love all those things. And there are great things that came out of those activities. But there was a sense of relaxation that I don't know if I've ever had before as a mom. So I think that I need to recognize that and maybe hopefully you had some moments of relaxation. You know, I didn't have to put on makeup in the morning because I could just get on a Zoom meeting. But what I did, I tried to be very intentional in my own household with my kids about how was I going to make it relaxed for them, and how could I give them a sense of control? Because even still, and probably all of you feel this way too, you have no sense of control right now. Am I right? we can't control what's going to happen in the next few weeks. So what I did with my kids is the day that they announced that there wasn't going to be school anymore, which was a sad, sad day for me. We had dinner, and I said, we are going to form our own university. This is what I told my kids. And we each had a role in the university. And in part, I was trying to explain to them, because my kids don't know. A lot of adults wouldn't know, like what's a provost, what's a chancellor, what's a dean, how do all these roles work together? So I explained that to them, the organizational chart. I said, we're going to form a university. I'm going to be the chancellor, and you're going to be like the deans. Because I think when I tell people like, oh, with my kids, we formed our own university, they assume that my kids were the students. But no, in our pretend university, we called it University of Strawberry, my kids were administrators, like me and my job as a chair. Okay, they weren't students, they were administrators. They had decision-making power. And so what I explained to them is how we make decisions in higher education. Okay, we bring a proposal to a committee meeting, we explain the proposal, and we vote on it. And that became the process that we used in our household. And that gave them lots of different perspectives, I would say. I was not the only one in charge, okay? Because quite frankly, like I said, I was exhausted, okay? I did not have the energy to be reinforcing all of these rules that I had before that now seemed really arbitrary and unnecessary. So this University of Strawberry system, anyone could bring a proposal to the table. I mean, and we had proposals about things like, don't leave your apple core out, like throw it away, which then in true higher ed fashion, we had to modify the proposal where it said any fruit or vegetable remnant, because we passed the apple core proposal and then people started leaving their pear cores around, and they said, listen, that's a policy violation. I said, no, the policy is apple cores. Okay, well, we need to reword that. But this is how it went in our house. And it was just a sort of a way of having fun, a way of teaching them about my job. Like, this is how I get things done. And it's hard to get other people to vote for your proposal. It's hard to get other people to see your perspective. It's hard to write a proposal that is specific enough that people can follow, but not too specific where there's other situations like the apple core that should pertain. So I was trying to give them some skills. Also, we would have curriculum committee meetings where we would talk about what they wanted to learn, the courses that we wanted to have. And these were things like, candle making, flower pressing, macaron. My daughter tried to make macarons. It took her like 3 attempts, but she finally got it. And I say that because it was a safe space to fail. And we talk about that a lot in education. There's a lot of research about how that's important, but it's very hard to do because we have ingrained ourselves and probably the people who work for us and probably unintentionally our children with the idea that when you try something, like, you need to do your best, it needs to be perfect. Okay, but there was no room for perfect during the pandemic. So they tried and honestly failed. We as a University of Strawberry failed at all kinds of stuff, like sourdough starter. Ours never did anything. We tried to grow some seeds and then we planted them outside. They all died, okay? It was a safe space to fail. And I knew that as a researcher, okay? I know that, but it was very hard. It was hard to do. But at the same time, I did not have time to be supervising all these activities that they were doing, you know? You wanna make macarons? That's great. I don't have time to help you, and I don't know how to make macarons. So like, you're on your own. Let me know if I need to take something out of the oven. And they didn't have that space before, just to be perfectly honest. I would have been there kind of hovering, right? That's what, making sure everything's okay. I don't want her to mess it up because she'll get upset. But I didn't, this is what I found out. I didn't need to do that. Just let her go. She figured it out, how to make macarons. It took her 3 times, but she figured it out. Like, what did it cost me? Well, the ingredients, right? For 3 times of macarons, an extra carton of eggs or whatever. She figured it out. She didn't need me there. And that is one of the biggest lessons I took away from this, is that my kids could do things that I didn't know. I had no idea, but I only found that out because I stepped back. And that it was okay to make mistakes. They made the menus at University of Strawberry. They ordered the food. So they were in charge, they had a budget. They were in charge of ordering the groceries. And one time we got 6 bags of apples instead of 6 apples. So we did? We made a bunch of apple recipes, okay? It was fine. It was okay. My daughter was totally embarrassed. She was mortified. It was fine. It was okay. So I hope that you had some experiences like that where you learned something about yourself, you learned something about your kids, and that we look on that experience as growth in the midst of very negative and lots of horrible things happening in our world, that we try to take a moment and recognize our own resilience and recognize the emotions that we're having, and be intentional about valuing those emotions, whatever they are, and then figuring out what we can control and how we can be more collaborative with the people who work for us and our kids, because the structures we had before aren't working right now. So I want to thank you so much for your patience listening to my little spiel. And I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to get to questions. And I did want to, I will put this in the chat too, but I don't know if you can see. This book is called Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett out of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And I will put this title in the chat. I would highly recommend this book. Some of what I was talking about with identifying emotions and emotional literacy is in this book. On the front cover of the book is this chart of emotions. And these are all in the you can't see very well, but there's words in here. And this is a spectrum of energy and pleasantness. And so red is high energy but low pleasantness. Blue is low energy, low pleasantness. So you can kind of get the idea. And so my kids really, really like that. They really like to be able to choose the word that describes what they're feeling. And this book is actually about how to implement this in schools, but I used it in my own home. So let's see, what questions do we have or comments?
What was the name of the other book by, was it Brene Brown?
Brene Brown, yes. And that was actually from her podcast, that technique, but I would highly recommend any of her books. They're really, she has a PhD, as does Mark Brackett. What I really like about both of them is they're well researched. So for us academics, there's a long reference list of other things we can read, but it's not so dry. It's not like a journal article. It's really easy to read. There's personal examples, but it's also well researched. So I appreciate that balance with both of those authors. And actually, Brene Brown has a podcast with Mark Brackett talking about his book. It's a very recent book, I think just less than a year old. So what other questions do we have?
Yeah, you mentioned about the do your best and don't fail. Can those be separated, kind of like you talked about the emotional, like getting to the core meanings of your emotional vocabulary?
So I think that we often equate do your best with perfection. Like if you try really hard, you can get, 100% on your homework, or, if you just try really hard, you can do whatever it is you want to do. And it's not always the case. And it puts a lot of pressure on, you know, the people who work for us and our own kids. And we probably do that to ourselves, right? So I think it was really interesting watching my daughter when she made those, I keep going back to the macarons, because it was this great educational example. Like she said to herself, she said to me, I know these are really hard to make, that even professional chefs struggle to make macaron. So I know that the first one I make, they're not going to be good. And I'm going to have to throw these away. But I'm going to go ahead and try it so that I know what to do for the next batch. Like, this is what she said to me out loud. And I just couldn't, like, that's exactly what we want all our kids to do. I was like, yes, this is great. But that's not what I was honestly seeing in school. What I see in school, unfortunately, is like, well, I want to get an A. Like, the teacher never says, like, try this homework and I'm going to expect for you to get these all wrong. No, that's not how we approach it. So it's just a whole different mindset shift, I think, to just expect to fail and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with failing. That's how we learn. Do the kids give up at some?
Are there any specific techniques that you feel are important that maybe we can take from our time the last 5 months and kind of incorporate that now as we're all coming back to work and going back to school?
So I think modeling. So when I talked about that emotional literacy, I would try to model that for my kids. I think we have a tendency to downplay. Like, we don't want our kids to see us upset or frustrated or angry. And so we kind of bury it. And then it comes out when we don't want it to. I actually tried the opposite, if that makes sense, where I would tell them, like, I'm worried about this. But I would also say positive things too, like, oh, this made me really happy. And I will say they got really attuned to my emotional state. So many times I would be on a Zoom meeting like this and I would look over and, like, one of my kids was sneaking in and they were putting a mug on my desk. And if they thought I was tired, it was a mug of coffee. And if they thought I was stressed, it was a mug of herbal tea. It was just fascinating how they really, and so when we're vulnerable and we model that emotional literacy, even with young kids, they pick up on it and they understand how to do that themselves. And they also understand how to care for other people, because you can't care for someone if you don't know that they're stressed, right? So that's a great question. Thanks. Any other questions? Let's see, I saw Sarah asked, did the kids give up at some point? Like, we gave up on the sourdough starter. All right. Sometimes it was like weighing how much more time and resources is it going to take to try this again? So, like, when we tried to grow the seeds, we planted them, they all died. We were like, forget it. I'm going to go and just buy the seedlings. So yes, there were times we gave up, but it was an intentional, like, we decided that we're not putting more resources into this and we're going to do something different. That makes sense. It wasn't, I'm so frustrated, I'm going to give up. It was, we're deciding to give up and here's why as a team. It's a great question. Oh, Kathy asked, which Brene Brown? Oh gosh. All of her stuff is really good. I would have to think about that. Look at the titles. That's a good question. Questions. Maybe I read Braving the Wilderness fairly recently, so that one I read that one recently, so that's a good one. She has one called The Gifts of Imperfect Parenting, which I appreciate. She has a whole curriculum for schools as well. So a lot of these are associated with schools.
I think we're kind of getting down to our last moment here, and we want to be very respectful of everyone's time. Thank you so much for speaking with us today and just sharing something that is really timely and bringing some, coping techniques and some aha moments with us. Just want to let everybody know that we are, this is the first kicking off a series of speakers, and that this will be something that we continue through the rest of the fall. So if you want to know what the schedule is, there we go. We may have additional speakers as well that are being added in. So make sure that you continually check back with us and sign up for all of the speaking presentations that appeal to you.
Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate your comments. Now I'll put my contact information in the chat if anyone has additional questions or comments for me.